The air was cold and still when the doors finally opened. A hidden chamber, untouched since 1944, lay beneath the ruins of an abandoned facility in northern Norway. Inside, rusted equipment, frostbitten crates, and the faint symbol of a black eagle etched into steel. The discovery was accidental, a construction crew widening a tunnel for a new hydroelectric project. But what they found wasn't supposed to exist. Documents sealed in wax, canisters labeled in Gothic script, and a name whispered through frozen air. Project Schwarzer Frost. For the first time in nearly 80 years, the world was about to uncover one of Nazi Germany's most secret wartime experiments, and the chilling truth of what human desperation can create when the world begins to fall apart. Chapter 1. The Black Frost Experiments Unearthed. Before the guns fell silent, before the world learned to fear the word atomic, the final winter of World War II gripped Europe in ice and exhaustion. Cities lay in ruins, supply lines faltered, and in the north, where the Arctic wind never stopped howling, the German High Command turned to science for miracles. It was 1944 and the Third Reich was collapsing from within. Yet deep in the mountains of northern Norway, a new kind of research had begun, one meant to change the outcome of the war by changing nature itself. The operation was known only by its code name, Project Schwarzer Frost. Officially, it didn't exist. It wasn't mentioned in archives, nor in testimony from Nuremberg. It was never spoken of by name, even among those who worked on it. The few surviving documents found decades later hinted at a desperate experiment, a weapon meant to harness cold, not as a metaphor, but as a force, to freeze infrastructure, disable machinery, and cripple enemy troops without a single bullet fired. Norway was chosen for its geography and its secrecy. The northern regions, occupied since 1940, offered isolation, deep mines, and an endless supply of cold. The German army had already constructed a network of tunnels under the mountains to store fuel and ammunition, but one of these tunnels was different. Engineers referred to it as Bunker E14 Farms, though the official registry never listed it. Local villagers were told it was a weather station. In truth, it was a laboratory, sealed, silent, and guarded by units reporting directly to the SS's Unearthed division. Before the discovery in 2023, no one alive had seen inside it, but eyewitness accounts from nearby towns tell fragments of the story. In the winter of 1944, convoys of trucks arrived under cover of darkness. Locals spoke of strange lights near the fjord, and the smell of chemicals carried on the wind. One fisherman recalled seeing barrels marked with a double lightning bolt symbol. Not ammunition, not oil, but something else entirely. Then, just as quickly, the activity stopped. By spring, the war was lost. The tunnels were sealed, and the project vanished into rumor. For decades, the site remained buried beneath snow and soil. Even after Norway rebuilt, the scars of occupation remained raw, and the mountain was left undisturbed. Only when modern developers began expanding hydroelectric lines did the sealed hatch resurface. A circular steel door, welded shut from the outside. It took engineers 2 days to cut through. What they found behind it was a tomb of technology. Frozen crates stamped with 1944 dates, rusted vials, and the remnants of German field equipment scattered across the concrete floor. Inside a half-collapsed laboratory, a faded plaque still hung on the wall. Reichskälte Institute, Polar Division. The words translate to Imperial Cold Institute. Among the frost and dust, a handful of papers survived, pages preserved in oilskin folders, their ink smudged but legible. They contained chemical formulas, tables of human body temperatures, and detailed sketches of frostbite progression at sub-zero exposure. The research was brutal and precise. Historians would later confirm that the Reichskälte Institute was real. It had branches in Munich and Königsberg during the war, focused on material endurance in cold climates. But nowhere, in any record, was there mention of a polar division. This was something else, something erased. When experts examined the recovered documents, they found evidence of field tests, coordinates in northern Finland, notes about subject endurance at 30 Celsius, and signatures of SS medical officers already tied to war crimes in Dachau and Ravensbrück. The implications were clear. Prisoners had been brought north, not to build fortifications, but to die in controlled conditions. Victims of what Nazi scientists called thermische Neutralisierung, thermal neutralization. It wasn't just an experiment in physics, it was an experiment in how far suffering could go in the name of progress. In the years following the war, both Allied and Soviet forces scrambled to capture German scientists. Operation Paperclip brought dozens to the United States. The Soviets, too, transported hundreds eastward to secret facilities near Leningrad and Sverdlovsk. But Schwarzer Frost had slipped through the cracks. No names appeared in post-war rosters, no files declassified. Until now, it was as if the project never existed. And yet, here it was, entombed in ice, a frozen fingerprint of a nation's last attempt to rewrite defeat through science. The discovery shocked the world, not just for what it revealed, but for what it implied. Because among the recovered artifacts were a few newer items. Cold War-era sampling tubes, labeled in English, dated 1957. Someone had been here long after the Nazis fell. Someone had kept watching this mountain, maybe even using it. Forensic analysis would later confirm it. Traces of American instrumentation, the same type used in Arctic survival experiments during the height of US-Soviet tensions. The question became unavoidable. Did the Allies continue what the Reich began, or did they bury it to ensure no one else ever could? The answers, as always, were buried in the ice. Chapter 2: The Descent into Secrecy. To understand how a project like Schwarzer Frost could exist, we must return to the final years of the Second World War, a time when science had become the last currency of power. In Berlin, desperation replaced strategy, factories burned, rail lines collapsed, and yet, in laboratories and hidden facilities across the Reich, teams of scientists still received funding, supplies, and orders to create the next miracle weapon. Hitler's high command clung to one belief, that some new discovery, some final invention, might halt the Allied advance and restore control. Germany wasn't alone in that belief. Every major nation, by 1944, was experimenting with the limits of human endurance, physics, and biology. The Allies had begun work on the atomic bomb. The Soviets tested nerve agents and propaganda warfare. In the chaos of global conflict, ethics blurred. Progress meant survival, and secrecy became as vital as oxygen. Inside the SS's sprawling network of research divisions, science was weaponized beyond recognition. The Unearthed, once a pseudo-academic organization studying racial theory, had transformed into a clearinghouse for special projects. Its leader, Heinrich Himmler, approved any experiment promising results, no matter how extreme. One such proposal arrived on his desk in late 1943, a report from the Reichskälte Institute, detailing thermal stress factors in Arctic environments. The report suggested that cold itself could be used strategically to immobilize armies, paralyze machinery, even freeze supply depots. Himmler approved immediate funding. Within months, the first teams departed for Norway. The scientists chosen for the project were not frontline soldiers. They were engineers, chemists, and physicians. Many recruited under coercion, others out of loyalty or ambition. Among them was Dr. Otto Weitz, a physician from Breslau known for his work on tissue preservation. His notes, recovered decades later, painted a grim picture of their mission. "We are told to understand cold as a weapon," he wrote in his journal, "to make it predictable, controllable, to harness the freeze before it harnesses us." Norway provided the ideal test ground, remote, secure, and already under heavy occupation. The project established its headquarters near Narvik, hidden within an abandoned ore facility. From there, teams ventured into the surrounding mountains, measuring ice formation, tracking temperature shifts, and, according to later testimony, performing endurance trials on human subjects taken from nearby camps. No one outside the command structure was told what truly occurred inside the tunnels. The war's final months brought chaos. German scientists understood that defeat was imminent, yet orders continued to arrive from Berlin. Accelerate production, destroy evidence, prepare for evacuation. Witnesses recalled trains departing north, carrying equipment and sealed containers marked biologische Proben, Frost, biological samples, Frost. By early 1945, Schwarzer Frost had ceased reporting to headquarters altogether. It vanished under its own secrecy. After Germany's surrender, Allied investigators began combing through every scientific site they could find. Operation Alsos targeted nuclear and chemical programs, seizing research before the Soviets could reach it. But Norway remained low on the priority list. its isolated tunnels deemed insignificant compared to Peenemünde or Dachau. Local resistance fighters destroyed bridges, mines, and facilities to prevent German return, sealing the mountain laboratories under tons of rock. What lay inside would remain untouched for generations. Yet even as the world celebrated victory, a new kind of war began. One fought not on battlefields, but in laboratories and boardrooms. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to capture Germany's scientific legacy. Operation Paperclip transferred over 1,600 German scientists to America. They brought with them blueprints, data, and expertise in rocketry, aviation, and medicine. The Soviets responded in kind, relocating entire research institutes to Siberia. The Cold War's earliest years were built on the foundations of Nazi science. Refined, rebranded, and repurposed, and somewhere in that transfer of knowledge, pieces of Schwarzer frost survived. Declassified documents from 1952 revealed that US military intelligence had intercepted a report titled Arctic Endurance Findings, E-14, referencing a site near Narvik. The file was partially redacted, its contents marked deemed non-essential to strategic operations, but the notation carried one telling phrase: potential for cryogenic field application. Decades later, when that phrase resurfaced in Freedom of Information requests, historians began to wonder, had the Americans continued this line of research under another name? British archives offered further clues. Correspondence between the Ministry of Defense and the Royal Air Force's Physiological Department discussed joint Arctic trials with US counterparts in 1957. The same year modern equipment was later found inside the Norwegian bunker. The overlap was no coincidence. It appeared that fragments of the Reich's cold research had found new life under Allied supervision. The scientists who once served ideology now served survival. They justified their work as necessary, a means to protect soldiers in extreme climates, to understand frostbite, to prepare for polar warfare. But beneath those explanations lay a darker continuity. Experiments still pushed human limits, often using volunteers unaware of true risks. In Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, Cold War research stations recreated the same conditions once tested in Nazi tunnels. The difference was only in language and secrecy. By the late 1960s, the world's attention had shifted elsewhere, to nuclear deterrence, space, and détente. The mountains of Norway faded from memory again. The documents that mentioned Schwarzer frost were filed, sealed, and forgotten. Only a handful of scientists, now elderly, carried the memory of what they'd studied. One of them, interviewed anonymously before his death in 1983, gave a single haunting remark. It was never about survival. It was about control. Control of nature and control of fear. That single sentence would later become the guiding theme for the documentary that followed the 2023 discovery. Because what began as a wartime desperation had evolved into something else. A pursuit of mastery over the most elemental force on Earth. Ice, cold, the ability to stop motion, halt time, and bring silence to the battlefield. In the shadows of history, Schwarzer frost was no longer just an experiment. It had become an idea, and ideas, unlike machines, never truly die. Chapter 3. The Frozen War Beneath the Mountain. The first descent into the recovered tunnels of Schwarzer frost began on February 12, 2023. The air was sharp, dry, and unnervingly still. Norwegian security forces stood watch outside as a mixed team of archaeologists, historians, and chemical specialists prepared to enter. Cameras rolled. Oxygen masks hissed. The mountain hadn't breathed in nearly 80 years. Now the past was about to exhale. When the door finally gave way, a wave of cold mist poured out, stale air meeting the warmth of the modern world. The lights from their helmets cut through the dark, revealing walls lined with corroded metal racks and icicles clinging like glass daggers. "It's like stepping into another century," one of the team whispered. Every footstep echoed, every breath turned to frost. The deeper they moved, the more the world outside disappeared. Only the hum of the generator and the rhythmic crunch of boots on ice remained. Then, they reached the main chamber. It was larger than anyone expected. A cavern of concrete reinforced by steel beams, the ceiling dripping from condensation. Along one wall stood massive cylindrical tanks, each fitted with old pressure gauges frozen in place. A faded stencil in Gothic script read, "Kälteversuch Nummer 7, nicht öffnen." Cold test number 7, do not open. Nearby, rusted instruments lay scattered across tables, thermometers, scalpels and glass slides sealed in resin. Someone, decades earlier, had tried to preserve what remained. The discovery team catalogued everything. Crates filled with handwritten notes, preserved vials, and 2 decayed medical stretchers still strapped with leather restraints. The scene was clinical and horrifying. It became clear that Schwarzer frost had been more than theoretical. These were not just environmental studies. These were human trials. The documentation that survived confirmed it. Records labeled Subject 24, Subject 31, followed by precise temperature exposure data and handwritten annotations in blue pencil. Muscle rigidity observed. Cardiac arrest at 6 minutes. Partial revival attempt failed. The documents weren't the only revelation. In a secondary chamber, sealed behind a collapsed steel partition, the team uncovered something unexpected: an insulated vault, its walls coated in frost. When they forced it open, they found rows of small metal canisters, each labeled with alphanumeric codes. Inside were biological samples, tissues, fluids, still partially frozen after nearly 8 decades. The team immediately halted the operation. Norwegian authorities quarantined the site, and NATO biological defense units were flown in within hours. For days, the discovery was kept from the public. Officials feared contamination, but what they feared more was exposure. The possibility that Allied forces had known about this site for decades. As forensic teams examined the canisters, they found something damning. 3 of them bore English-language markings. Stenciled across the lids were the words USAF, Property of Air Material Command. The serial numbers matched a batch of experimental sampling containers manufactured in 1957. Someone had entered the tunnels after the war, someone who wasn't German. The press eventually broke the story, but the deeper truth remained classified. Behind closed doors, an investigation began. Leaked documents later revealed the operation's codename, Project Halide, a joint Anglo-American study on cryogenic endurance, officially focused on survival physiology in extreme climates. The connection to Schwarzer frost was undeniable. The Allies had not only found the facility, they had used it, possibly even continued its research under Cold War secrecy. Forensic teams recovered photographic negatives showing uniformed men, American and British, standing beside German-era equipment. The date scratched into the film's edge, 1958. Their faces were blurred by time, but the context was clear. The Cold War's hunger for technological advantage had crossed moral lines once thought unthinkable. The same mountain that had once served the Reich's vision of domination had become a testbed for Western defense against the Soviet Union. Yet, beneath the political shadow, the mountain kept its silence. Inside the chamber, evidence of human life lingered in the smallest details. A pair of wire-framed glasses crushed beneath rubble, a child's mitten wedged between crates, a coffee tin used as an ashtray. The people who had once lived and died here had names that history forgot, their identities buried under phrases like subjects, samples, and variables. The scientific reports were methodical, emotionless, and devastatingly precise. Page after page of observations, heart rate, temperature, organ failure, ending always with the same clinical verdict: termination. The narration of the documentary slows here. The camera would linger on the frost-covered walls, the faded handwriting, the eerie stillness. The viewer would hear the narrator's voice drop lower, slower. "These were people," he would say, "not numbers, not data points, people frozen in the final hours of a dying empire, and later, in the early years of another." As the investigation unfolded, journalists uncovered satellite imagery from 1962 showing new access roads carved toward the mountain, roads that never appeared on Norwegian maps. The pattern repeated across the Arctic: Greenland, Svalbard, northern Canada, isolated outposts linked by a shared purpose, mastering survival in the cold. But survival, in the context of Schwarzer frost, had always been secondary to control. Control over temperature, control over nature, control over death itself. Late that year, Norway's parliament held a closed hearing on the discoveries. Few details were released, but one witness, a retired intelligence officer, described classified communications between NATO and the US Department of Defense in 1959 WWII cables referenced post-frost acquisitions, a phrase chillingly similar to the original codename. Whatever was tested beneath the mountain, it didn't end with the Nazis. It evolved. The scientists of Project Schwarzer Frost believed that through precise manipulation of temperature and pressure, biological systems could be paused indefinitely, suspended between life and death. What they began for warfare, others later saw as the foundation for cryogenics. But the ethics were lost in translation. Decades later, pieces of their data appeared in Western scientific journals under anonymous citations. Modern cryogenic technology, some argued, carried a legacy no one wanted to admit. By the time the tunnels were resealed in late 2023, the world had seen only fragments of the truth. Most evidence was classified again, this time under NATO jurisdiction. The official explanations cited biohazard containment. Unofficially, it was clear what lay beneath that mountain had implications far beyond history. The research was too advanced for its time, too specific to have been the product of desperation alone. Someone, somewhere, had ensured its survival. As the last team left the site, one of the archaeologists looked back through the frozen doorway. "It feels like it's waiting," she said softly, "like it never ended." Her breath turned to mist in the beam of her headlamp, and then disappeared into the dark. The past, it seemed, had only been sleeping. Chapter 4: Shadows After the Thaw. When the tunnels of Schwarzer Frost were finally resealed, the world above them felt unchanged. Quiet, indifferent, as though the mountain itself had swallowed the truth once more. But for those who had entered, nothing felt normal again. Weeks passed, and yet the images lingered. The frost-covered instruments, the faded handwriting, the unmistakable evidence that human beings had been treated as expendable material in the pursuit of control. For the researchers, the discovery had not been a triumph of archaeology. It had been a confrontation with conscience. Outside the scientific teams and intelligence circles, the public learned little. A brief press statement described a historical laboratory site and potential chemical contamination. No mention of the human element. No mention of the later Cold War involvement. For ordinary Norwegians, it was simply another buried reminder of the war that had once occupied their homeland. But among the historians who studied it, the mood was heavy, not of excitement, but of grief. One of them, Dr. Ingrid Solheim, led the recovery team's documentation unit. She later described standing inside the tunnel for hours after everyone else had left, her breath echoing against the walls. "It wasn't just a site," she said quietly. "It was a grave. You could feel it." Her team catalogued hundreds of artifacts, but what haunted her most were the personal items. A pocket watch, still ticking faintly when warmed by hand, a half-burned letter in Polish, signed only with initials, and a photograph of a woman holding a child, the edges scorched by chemical burns. For weeks, she couldn't stop thinking about that photo. Who they were, whether they survived, whether the scientist who carried it had been proud or ashamed. Meanwhile, political pressure mounted. Norway demanded full transparency from NATO. The United States and the United Kingdom both denied post-war involvement, despite mounting archival evidence. The secrecy deepened, echoing the Cold War habits of classification and deflection. Declassified cables later revealed quiet negotiations, not about truth, but about liability. No nation wanted to admit that it had inherited the moral debris of Nazi science. As winter gave way to spring, the snow began to melt around the excavation site. The mountain, once silent, was alive again with runoff and birdsong. Yet within its thawed soil, fragments of history surfaced. Scraps of paper, broken glass, a single rusted dog tag bearing a serial number that did not match any known registry. It belonged to a man who had never officially existed. Local authorities buried it in a marked grave overlooking the fjord, a symbolic gesture for those whose names were lost. People from nearby villages came to leave flowers. For them, the war had ended long ago, but its ghosts had finally spoken. In Oslo, the National Archives began compiling what was now known as the Frost Report. Hundreds of pages of findings, transcripts, and recovered documents. Within those pages lay a tragic pattern, one that stretched far beyond Nazi Germany. Again and again it showed how fear justified cruelty, how nations, in moments of desperation, blurred the line between discovery and destruction, and how secrecy, once established, rarely died. Among the recovered notebooks was a single entry dated April 8, 1945. The handwriting was hurried but legible. They have told us the war is lost. The samples are to be destroyed, but the data must survive. The Americans will come soon. If anyone finds this, do not repeat our mistakes. It was signed simply, Weitz. The same Dr. Otto Weitz, whose earlier journals had helped piece together the project's origins. He hadn't fled south as many believed. He had stayed, and likely died in that frozen chamber. That note, historians said, changed everything. It revealed a man who had once participated in horror, but who in the end tried to preserve a warning. Weitz's plea became the emotional center of the investigation, and the documentary that followed. His name, once lost to history, became a reminder that even within the machinery of evil, there were those who saw too late what they had become. The documentary's tone softened here. The narration slowed. The music faded into the sound of wind across the fjord. The images shifted from cold machinery to the faces of survivors, Norwegians who had lived through occupation, and the descendants of prisoners who vanished during the final winter of the war. They spoke not of vengeance, but of memory, of wanting the truth preserved, not buried again. History, one elderly man said, isn't what we remember, it's what we choose to forget. For months after the discovery, teams continued their work in silence. Artifacts were catalogued, decontaminated, and sealed in controlled archives. Most were never displayed publicly, but within academic circles, discussions grew. Not about the science, but about the pattern of secrecy that connected Nazi Germany to the Cold War and beyond. The hunger for advantage had not ended with Hitler's fall. It had simply changed uniforms. The emotional weight of Schwarzer Frost reached beyond the history community. Writers, filmmakers, and ethicists began asking the same question. How much of modern progress is built on knowledge gathered in darkness? Cryogenic research, survival training, and even modern aerospace medicine all bore traces of data that could be linked, however faintly, to experiments once deemed necessary. The line between inheritance and complicity blurred. By late 2024, the site had been sealed permanently. A memorial plaque was placed at the tunnel entrance, reading in both German and Norwegian. Here, human life was measured in degrees. May no one forget what was lost in the cold. Each winter, as snow covers the fjord again, local residents light candles there. They don't speak of science or politics. They speak of people, of the ordinary lives consumed by the ambitions of those who believed they could command nature itself. The aftermath of the discovery wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet, mournful, a reckoning whispered rather than shouted. The world didn't change overnight. But those who saw the inside of the mountain never looked at progress the same way again. Because in the frost, they had glimpsed what humanity is capable of when fear and power outweigh empathy. And perhaps that realization, more than any classified file or recovered document, was the true legacy of Project Schwarzer Frost. Chapter 5: Echoes of Ice. Years have passed since the steel door was resealed and the mountain returned to silence. The snow has hidden the scars again. The world has moved on, its attention drawn to new conflicts, new technologies, new frontiers. But beneath that calm surface, the questions uncovered by Project Schwarzer Frost still linger, persistent, cold, and unresolved. What does it mean when knowledge outlives morality? When science, born of cruelty, becomes the foundation of progress? Those who worked on the Frost investigation still ask themselves these questions. For them, the discovery was never about relics. It was about responsibility. Every artifact catalogued, every report translated, carried the weight of human suffering. And yet, that same data, those same observations, helped shape decades of legitimate research in cryobiology and extreme environment medicine. The paradox is unbearable, that something so monstrous could also be useful. Historians now debate whether the Allies' decision to bury Schwarzer Frost was an act of protection or of self-preservation. Did they hide it to prevent the world from repeating it, or to conceal that they already had? Files declassified in 2025 show an unsettling continuity between post-war military research and Nazi experimental data. Notes from American and British laboratories referenced pre-1945 endurance trials, never citing their source, but clearly drawing from them. The scientists involved likely believed they were serving peace. But peace built on silence is fragile, and silence, like ice, cracks under pressure. In Norway, the site remains off limits. The tunnels are monitored, the entrances guarded, and radiation and biohazard sensors still flicker green. Nature has reclaimed much of it, moss growing over rusted hinges, snow filling old footprints. But every so often, hikers report hearing faint metallic echoes when the wind cuts through the fjord. Probably just shifting ice, the locals say. But some of them remember the headlines, and they know better. The descendants of those who lived through occupation have taken ownership of the story. In schools across the country, the frost discovery is now taught not as a military secret, but as a moral lesson. Teachers speak of how fear distorts intention, how progress can devour compassion if left unchecked. Cold, one lecturer told his class, isn't just a temperature, it's a condition of the human heart when we stop feeling for others. The students sit quietly, not out of confusion, but because they understand. Meanwhile, in academic circles, the debate continues. Should nations destroy data born of atrocity, or study it to prevent future harm? There are no easy answers. Some argue that erasing it would be another form of denial, pretending it never happened. Others believe that using it perpetuates the very dehumanization that created it. The files of Schwarzer Frost remain sealed, locked away in NATO's archives under the highest classification, not because of their danger, but because of their reflection. They mirror the world that created them, and the world that still benefits from their shadows. In a quiet corner of Oslo's War Museum, one object from the site is displayed publicly, Dr. Otto Weitz's final note. The paper, yellowed and torn, rests under glass beside a plaque that reads, "Do not repeat our mistakes." Visitors pause before it, often in silence. They see the trembling handwriting of a man who understood too late the cost of obedience. A man who saw that his pursuit of knowledge had stripped him of humanity, and they read his words not as history, but as warning. Outside that museum, life continues. Cars passing, people talking, the hum of modernity echoing through the streets. Yet the irony is hard to miss. The same technologies that keep aircraft in the Arctic sky, that preserve vaccines, that sustain astronauts in the void, all trace faintly back to the era when science served death. Every breath of progress carries a shadow. Every discovery asks the same unspoken question. Have we truly learned, or have we simply become more efficient? The final scenes of the documentary would linger on these ideas. A slow aerial shot of the Norwegian mountains under winter light. The narrator's voice, low, steady, reflective, speaking not of nations or politics, but of people. History, he would say, is not buried in the ground. It breathes through us. It waits for us to listen. And when we forget, it waits to be found again. Then, silence. Just the wind through the fjord. Because in the end, Project Schwarzer Frost was never only about the weaponization of cold. It was about what happens when fear replaces empathy, when secrecy becomes tradition, and when the lessons of one war freeze within us, waiting for the next to thaw them out. The past does not melt. It endures, in steel, in ice, and in memory.